Welcome to the first of our 3 live presentations about the Tour du Mont Blanc, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marvin, and I'm the founder and general manager of Alpine Cols. Alpine Cols is a group of cycling coaches based in the Alps, 4 French, 1 New Zealander French, and 1 Anglo-French, which is me. The first presentation, this evening, will be about guidelines for your personal training plan, and will especially focus on the first part of your training, meaning the period from now until April. It will last 35 to 40 minutes. The remaining 2 presentations are on the 30th of March, when I'll present part 2 of the training plan, and finally on the 29th of June, when I'll present how to get your best result on the day. I'll answer any questions at the end, but don't hesitate to send any questions to me later by email at info@alpinecols.com. I'll reply to everybody just as soon as I can. So let's take a look at the parcours. The Tour du Mont Blanc is often referred to as the toughest one-day sportive in the world. As you know, it's a loop around the highest mountain in Europe, passing through 3 countries on the way: France, Switzerland, and Italy. I'm not going to describe the route in detail today. Suffice to say that it covers 330 kilometers and includes 8,300 meters of vertical ascent, spread out over 5 major climbs and a bunch of shorter ones, adding up to a total of about 154 kilometers of climbing. These are huge numbers, and you must not take this event lightly. I can't emphasize too highly how tough this event is, and therefore the importance of preparing properly for it. Everybody starts in the dark, 5 o'clock in the morning, and unlike the guy in the photo, many will finish after nightfall, perhaps having to do the descent from the Combe de Rosalind in the dark, as well as the final climb to the Césis. The cut-off time to finish is midnight, so all finishers take somewhere between 12 and 19 hours. In a good year, the attrition rate is around 40%. And frankly, it's better not to ask how high it is when the weather's bad. The event is above all an endurance challenge, and although all participants are timed, there's no official classification, and all finishers receive a medal and a well-deserved gold certificate. It's really a challenge on 3 levels: mental, physical, and nutritional. The most likely reason to abandon, however, is mental. For most first-timers, it will be the toughest thing you've ever done by some margin. At the halfway point, you'll have ridden almost the equivalent of the Marmot, but it's still only halfway. To reach the finish, you'll probably push yourself to your limits and then have to go beyond them. You can expect to experience highs and lows, with moments of euphoria where you can't believe how strong you feel, followed by moments of despair where you can't believe how bad you feel. Many people think of quitting more than once. Those who prepared properly can usually find the tenacity and the determination they need to keep going and finish. Before we talk about how to train for it, we need to understand what it takes to do well at the Tour du Mont Blanc. In other words, what are the event demands? And you really can't develop an effective training plan until you understand what the event asks of you. I've analyzed the demands in 3 categories, so let's take a look at them. First category is physiological. The first 2 are pretty obvious. You need excellent aerobic endurance for 12 to 19 hours of total cycling and multiple long climbs. You also need a high power to weight ratio to make it easier to do the climbs. So those 2 are obvious. Now, a bit more technical. You need a high capacity to burn fat instead of glycogen at race pace. And finally, you need the ability to recover quickly on the descents between long efforts on the climbs. Looking now at the psychological demands, the first is the ability to maintain focus, motivation, and lucidity for the time it takes to finish, even when you're severely fatigued. The second one is the self-discipline to stick to your optimum pace on the climbs, which will often mean letting people go, let them go past you. Either you'll catch them up later or else you won't. And if you don't, it's because they're stronger than you anyway. The third one is the ability to tolerate high levels of pain and discomfort, which you're certainly going to experience on the Tour du Mont Blanc. And finally, the ability to stay positive and to deal with inevitable setbacks and negative thoughts that you will definitely have at various times during the day. The last set of demands are technical. The first ones obviously are climbing skills. You need excellent climbing skills on long climbs and varied gradients. You need the ability to refuel effectively with nutrition and hydration choices that work for you throughout the day. You need excellent descending and cornering skills, because if there's 154 kilometers of climbing, there's the same amount of descending, more or less. And finally, it's very helpful to have the ability to change clothing or at least adjust for temperatures while you're riding. You can lose an awful lot of time if you have to stop at the top and bottom of every climb to take jackets off, put them back on, and so on and so forth. Now, it's certainly possible to reach the finish line of the Tour du Mont Blanc without being excellent on all of these criteria, but it will, however, obviously take you longer and it will feel harder. Each criterion is important, and your particular combination will determine your overall performance, or indeed whether or not you can even finish. Now, looking at the plan, it's important to understand that there's no such thing as a standard training plan for the Tour du Mont Blanc that will work for everybody. A training plan is always, or should always, be designed with a specific event and a specific rider profile in mind. Because what works for one rider and one event won't necessarily work for another rider, or even for the same rider at another event. The best training plan for you is one that's been designed with your personal goals, your strengths, your limiters, your experience, your context, and your constraints. And on top of that, it's constantly adapted for you as and when things change, which they always do. For all these reasons, we're not providing a detailed day-to-day training plan. But what we are providing is a framework and a set of guidelines for you to adapt to your own unique circumstances. Our goal is to give you the means to think carefully about the process and to take responsibility for your own preparation. Inevitably, part of what I say may not be appropriate for you because I don't know your individual situation. So looking at the general principles, this is the first and most important principle. If you want to do well at the Tour du Mont Blanc, you need to make it a priority. Not only in your training, but also, at least to some extent, in your life. And if this needs negotiation with your partner or your family, now's the time to do it. Next, you must be consistent. It's no use training really hard for 2 weeks and then doing nothing for the next 2 weeks, or only training on weekends. You should be doing some sort of training on at least 4 and better 5 days per week. Point 3. The single most important quality you need to develop is your aerobic base. Remember, this is number 1 on the event demands. Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts to this. You need to spend a lot of time on your bike, mostly at low intensity. Low intensity will create the endurance adaptations you need without adding unnecessary fatigue. I want to go into this in a bit more detail because it's often misunderstood. So why ride at low intensity? Surely, if you want to ride faster, you should train faster. Well, it's not so simple. The key point is you get all the aerobic adaptations you need at low intensity. And making every ride as hard as you can is a very ineffective way to train because of all the extra fatigue. It will work when you first start cycling, but you will soon hit a plateau and you won't be able to progress. Looking at the chart, most beginners, and indeed many club riders, train something like the blue bars on this chart, with most of their time spent riding quite hard in zones 3 and 4 on a 7-zone model. So that's the tempo and threshold zones. It's now been shown that it's more effective to do the majority of your training at at low intensity and, of course, high volume, combined with a small amount at high intensity and low volume. This is called polarized training, and it's what I highly recommend for the Tour du Mont Blanc, and indeed for the Tour du Mont Blanc, more 90-10 than 80-20. To do polarized training right, you need to be clear on the zones. And all you need is really 3 zones. Here's a very simple 3-zone model, which is all you need. The most important zone boundary is between zone 1 and zone 2. This is called LT1, the first lactate threshold, and it's the point at which the lactate concentration in your blood begins to increase as you do more work and use more oxygen. You should do the majority of your training at or below this threshold. So how can you determine it? Well, the best way is to do a lab test where they measure the lactate concentration in your blood while you increase the load by steps on a turbo. This is, however, expensive and not always easy to find. So what you can do is estimate it yourself by doing a step test on your turbo at home, starting at a very easy load such as 75 or 80 watts and increasing by 15 or 20 watts every 3 or 5 minutes. Pay very careful attention to your breathing and note the power and heart rate at the time when your breathing starts to get deeper. This indicates you've just crossed the threshold and you're using more oxygen. It will probably take place at a much lower intensity than you think. For most people, it's no more than 60 to 65% of their maximum heart rate or their FTP, and it may even be lower than that. Low intensity is low intensity. Now back to our list of general principles. The 4th principle is to develop your fat burning capacity. This probably needs some explanation to understand why it's important, so let's take a couple of minutes on that as well. During endurance exercise, our body has 2 possible sources for energy, basically glucose or fat. There are important differences between the 2. First, only glucose works at high intensity, whereas at low intensity, your body should be using both in proportions which depend on the intensity. Second, your body can only store about 2,000 calories of energy in the form of glucose, or more precisely, glycogen, whereas it can store at least 50,000 calories in the form of fat. This means that, to draw the analogy with a car, we have an engine that can burn 2 different types of fuel, but we only have a small tank of the fuel needed to go fast, while there's a huge tank of the other fuel which can only help us to go relatively slowly. There's therefore a huge advantage if you can burn a high percent of fat at race pace, because you're conserving glycogen for the hardest efforts only. Someone who burns very little fat at race pace is forced to burn through their reserves of glycogen, and once they're gone, they're gone. They have to slow down. So let's see what that means at the Tour du Mont Blanc. Here's the metabolic challenge of the Tour du Mont Blanc. If you're to finish in less than 19 hours, you will spend approximately 15 hours climbing for 19 hours. Doing the calculations for a 70-kilogram cyclist with 10 kilograms of bike and equipment, he or she will expend about 11,000 calories in energy, on top of the 2,000 or so which are required just to stay alive. Now, the maximum amount you can reasonably hope to consume on the bike in 19 hours is around 6,000 calories. That means consuming over 300 calories an hour, which means for example, a large bottle of energy drink and 2 or even 3 energy bars or their equivalent, and doing that hour after hour for 19 hours. That is not easy. Remember that you only have about 2,000 calories stored in glycogen, which means there's a deficit of at least 3,000 calories. If you can't get this from fat, you are going to find it really hard to continue. And I believe this is the major reason why so many people are forced to abandon. They're just not metabolically adapted to burn fat sufficiently enough at the pace they're trying to ride at. So obviously you have this huge advantage if you can burn a high percentage of fat at race pace. But the thing is, there are very wide variations between people. As you can see from the chart, which was taken from a research study, even amongst well-trained cyclists, which should certainly include everybody who's riding at the Tour du Mont Blanc, the variations are huge, with fat oxidation ranging between 100% at rest to only 20%. The researchers found a similar distribution at race pace, but shifted towards less fat burning. The curve goes to the right. So the very best could only manage 40% of fat burning and 60% of glycogen, and many were down to 0. Now, the good news is that it's trainable. It not only varies between people, but it can, at least to a reasonable extent, be trained. So we'll come back on that a bit later in the presentation to see how. Now, back to our list. The 5th principle is to build your pain tolerance. One of the best definitions of endurance that I've ever come across is that endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. For many people on the Tour du Mont Blanc, this struggle against the desire to stop will begin in earnest on the Col du Petit Saint-Bernard, when there is still 100 kilometers to ride and over 3,000 meters to climb. There's no escaping the fact that the Tour du Mont Blanc will make you suffer. The more you train yourself to tolerate the pain and discomfort, the better your chances of finishing the event. It's a tough event. There's just no getting away from it. The 6th principle is to increase the load during your training progressively. Just an example, if you're currently only training, let's say 5 hours a week, and you want to increase it to 12 hours per week, you should take at least a month to get there, because your body needs that time to adapt. Number 7, never lose sight of the fact that your body only gets stronger when you rest or recover. Training breaks you down and creates the stimulus you need, but you only get stronger during recovery. It's really important to allow your body the time it needs to adapt and get stronger. Even if you have the time, you should not try to train every day. It will be counterproductive. Number 8, monitor your readiness for high load. This is important because research over the last few years has shown that training hard only has a positive effect if your body is in a state to benefit from it. So let's look at how we can monitor that. The issue is that recovery and adaptation is inhibited by stress, whether it be training stress or life stress or both. All of this stress forces your body to secrete various hormones that are needed to manage the stress, but which also, unfortunately, inhibit your training recovery. Unfortunately, there's a very easy way to measure your current level of total stress. You don't need to test for the hormones, but just for their effect on your heart rate, and especially your heart rate variability. You can do that by installing the HRV4 training app on your telephone and then measure your heart rate variability every morning just after waking up. It takes 1 minute. After a week, the app will report your normal range. So long as your heart rate your variability is normal, all is good. Train as per your plan. On the example here, you can see the daily readings, which are the blue bars, the 7-day moving average, which is the white line, and the normal range, which is the dotted white lines with the gray part in the middle. So these were my readings during a particular week in May. And in this case, all was good for the beginning of the week until the 20th of May, the one from last day that's showing there, when the reading was well below the normal range and showing in yellow. So I simply took the day off, and the next day it recovered. Sometimes it takes more than 1 day, and you just have to wait and be patient. So the key is, if it's outside, if your daily reading is outside your normal range, you train easy or not at all. This is a fairly complex subject. If you'd like more on this, check out our recent video that you can find on our YouTube channel, or if you prefer reading, you can find our recent blog article, which is on the Alpine Cols website. Finally, last but not least, amongst these general principles, you should include some exercises in your training to develop your technical skills, such as descending, cornering, eating on the bike, your ability to take off your jacket and put it back on while riding, and so on and so forth. All of those added together, improving your skills, can make a tremendous difference in the time that you'll take to complete the tour. So now we've talked about general principles, let's take a look at the training plan framework. It includes 3 phases or periods. The first being preparation, where you're preparing your body for a significantly increased training load and developing your aerobic and fat-burning capacities. Next, it's the pre-competition period, which starts in April and runs to the end of June. And in this period, you're going to add more volume to get yourself ready for the actual event itself. And finally, the last 3 weeks is the competition or taper period, where you reduce your fatigue without losing any fitness. Here you can see our framework training plan, which you can download from the Tour du Mont Blanc website under practical infos. Or if you're not finding it, just send me an email to request it. Make sure it's the latest updated version done in November 22 for the 2023 Tour du Mont Blanc. It's a framework and not a detailed day-by-day training plan for the reasons I've already explained. The idea is that if you understand the reasoning and the rationale, you can design your own training plan that's perfectly tailored for you. I'm not going to go through the plan in detail. Let me just highlight the structure. The first page tells you, which we're looking at here, tells you what to focus on during each period and why. And there's a second page with suggested workouts for each period. Each phase is broken down into 4-week cycles, including 3 load weeks and 1 recovery week, with a target training load for each week. If you're over 50, there's some evidence that adopting a 3-week cycle of 2 load weeks and 1 recovery week might be beneficial, so that's worth thinking about. Here's the second page, which provides you with a typical training week and suggested workouts during each period. So again, not commenting that in detail, you can find that on the website or send me an email and I'll send you a copy. So how do you take the framework and customize it for yourself? It's best to be pragmatic and start with your constraints, and especially your training time availability. Be realistic here and confirm it with your partner and family. That might save you a lot of misunderstandings and arguments in the future. Which days of the week can you train and for how long? What are the family or work commitments that will prevent you from training on certain days or weeks? Once you've thought this through, you can block off week by week the training time you'll have available. You'll probably end up with something that's quite a long way away from ideal, but that can't be helped. In any case, it will have to be adjusted as things change over the coming months. Adjust things as much as you can to respect the principles of increasing the training load, followed by recovery in 3 or 4 week cycles. Now, let's look at what should be in part 1 of your training plan, which is during the preparation phase. So that runs from now until the end of March. The key objectives or focus during this period are 1, to build your ability to train for 10 or 15 hours or more per week and to ride long distances without undue fatigue. 2, and really as part of the first objective, the 2 go together, to build your fat burning capacity. Now, these 2 should represent 90% of your training. The remaining 10% is to build strength and strength endurance, which will also positively impact your pain tolerance. And finally, include some exercises to work on technical skills such as descending and cornering at speed. So those are the objectives and the focus. Now let's look at how to do it. How to build aerobic endurance? There are no shortcuts. There just aren't any shortcuts. Progress to 5, then 6 hours at low intensity. Don't be tempted to push harder. The goal here is time, it's not kilometers. It doesn't matter how many kilometers you ride in 6 hours. What matters is riding 6 hours. So remember, these rides are supposed to feel slow. One way to know if it's slow enough is to see if you can talk absolutely normally. You should be able to hold a normal conversation while riding at low intensity. If you're gasping for breath and have to speak in short sentences, you're going too fast, that's for sure. 90% of your training should be like this. These long, slow rides are also going to help you burn more fat, but only if you adapt your diet. The more carbohydrate and especially sugar you consume, the more your body will prefer to burn glucose. So obviously that's not desirable. Of course, at the same time, it's important to adjust your total calories consumed to be equivalent to the calories you're burning. If you eat too much, you're going to put on weight. If you don't eat enough, you're not going to fuel your training and you're going to run into trouble. So you need to get it about right. So let's look at a few basic recommendations how to get there. So adapting your diet to turn yourself more into a fat burner. The basic guideline is to adopt a macronutrient split, which is approximately 48, 24, 28% split between carbohydrate, protein, and fat, calculated on the basis of calories. Note that I'm not advocating a low-carb, high-fat diet. This diet may be appropriate, an LCHF diet may be appropriate for ultra-endurance events, but even there it's not certain, and the experts are divided in their opinion. So to reach this split of 48, 24, 28, you probably need to limit your intake of carbs compared to where you are today, and especially white sugar and high glycemic index carbs. Finally, you should prefer natural, non-processed foods as much as possible. That in a way goes without saying, but it's perhaps worth mentioning. So let's take a look at each category of macronutrient. In terms of carbs, you should prefer the most natural and complex varieties, such as fruit and vegetables, lentils, beans, pulses, nuts, and so on. And avoid everything that's on the right, sugar in all its refined forms, cakes, biscuits, and in fact industrial foods in general. It's just if you want to train your body to burn fats, you just got to stay away from that. That's the bad news of the night. In terms of protein, here too it's important to choose based on the quality. We're looking to get 24% of calories from protein. You want to look at poultry, fish, lean meat, cheese, Greek yogurt are all good sources of animal protein, as well as, of course, the vegetable proteins that you find in lentils, beans, cereals, nuts, tofu, chickpeas, oats, wild rice, and various other vegetables. Fats, the last category. Fats, remember, are essential for health, especially natural mono and polyunsaturated fats, the famous omega-3 and omega-6. You want to get 28% of your calories from fats. Good sources are things like avocados, cheese, especially hard cheeses such as Parmesan, olives and olive oil, nuts and seeds, and also coconuts, coconut oil, oily fish, of course, we saw on the protein page, salmon, sardines, mackerel, trout, tuna, all of that sort of stuff. Yogurt, whole fat, of course, eggs, and perhaps the good news of the night, dark chocolate is a good source of top quality fats in moderation, obviously. Finally, on the bike, do your long rides fasted for the first 2 to 3 hours. That will help you, when there's no glucose running around in the system, then obviously your body's got to look for fat, so it's going to really help. While you're on the bike, avoid using energy drinks, for the preparation phase, indeed right up until probably the last 4 weeks or so, when you need to start getting used to them again. Until then, it's better to stick to water. Now, you still need to eat something, of course, on a 6 to 7 hour ride, but rather than eating energy bars, you do better to take things like dried fruit, bananas, small potatoes. There's some interesting research done recently which showed that small potatoes, or cooked potatoes, are just as effective as gels to fuel your ride. Wholemeal sandwiches, rice cakes, and so on and so forth. So all of those good things to eat on the bike, as opposed to the more white sugar rich energy bars and things of that nature. Now let's take a look at the 10% of your training that should be focused on high intensity. When it comes to the day, you shouldn't ride at all at high intensity during the Tour du Mont Blanc. You're just not going to do it. So what's the point of doing some training at high intensity? Well, let's look at the power duration curve to understand. These high intensity training sessions, which are apparently really only going to affect the left-hand upper part of the power duration curve, they're really about two things. The first is that will also, working in that area, will also pull your FTP higher because it brings the whole curve up. Even short intervals have that effect. And the other advantage of doing this 10% high intensity is it's all about increasing your pain tolerance. So let's look at some examples. If we look at very short intervals such as sprints, if it's a sprint session, you can do from 5 to 10 7-second sprints during an otherwise easy ride. On the recording here, you can see 3 sprints with my power in yellow and my heart rate in red. You want to leave enough time between each sprint for your heart rate to come back down. Do this for a complete 2 or 3 week mesocycle, then recover. The next mesocycle, you could do 15-second sprints, and the one after 30-second sprints. Try to keep the power as constant as possible from start to finish. Your power will, of course, be lower during a 30-second sprint than during a 7-second one, but try and keep it as high and as constant as possible. Later, you could either use Tabata-type intervals with very short recovery, such as 3 blocks of 12 by 20 10s or 40 20s, with 5 to 10 minutes between blocks, or move to longer intervals, first 1 minute and then 2 minute or 3 minutes, with equal recovery time between. Remember that these are as much about pain tolerance as anything else, so they're supposed to hurt. You should push them hard. It can be beneficial to do them at low cadence because it helps both your pedal stroke and, to a certain extent, your leg strength. Finally, you should build in some exercises for technical skills, as we've already mentioned. Take every opportunity on your long rides to practice them. If you're not a confident descender, you might want to consider joining a training camp in the mountains with a coaching team qualified to teach you to do this. Of course, we offer these type of camps, so if you feel you need that, please get in touch. Now, here's an unpopular subject. Sadly, the best way to strengthen your muscles is off the bike. You want to be focusing mostly on leg and core strength with 1 or 2 sessions per week, ideally guided by a strength and conditioning coach who knows cycling. The goal at this time of year is to increase the strength of your leg and core muscles. It also contributes to increasing your pain tolerance, of course, if you do it right. If you're new to this, err on the side of caution to limit the risk of injury, because it is actually quite easy to injure yourself. I'm speaking from experience. The most basic exercises are squats, lunges, planks, bridges, bicycle kicks, and roll downs and stuff like that. But there are many more which are beneficial. The key is to learn the proper technique. Next, and in parallel, mobility and stretching, or mobility and flexibility stretching and so on. 2 to 3 20-minute sessions per week. Pilates or yoga can be extremely beneficial. And again, learning correct technique is vital. So choose a practitioner who knows cycling and only takes small groups, who better still will work with you as an individual. I'll strongly recommend that you complement all this cycling and all of this gym work with complementary activities, such as walking, running, swimming, or whatever. If cycling is, and the reason is, if cycling is your only sport, you risk building up imbalances and soft tissue problems over time. So it's not very healthy to be a pure cyclist and never do anything else. Voila, as they say in French, that's it. I've given you the principles and guidelines that should allow you to prepare yourself well between now and April. Rendezvous on the 30th of March to see how things have gone and talk about the pre-competition and caper periods. In the meantime, it's up to you. Take the principles, create your own training plan, and then follow it. If you'd like professional help to be absolutely your best on D-Day, we can help you in 2 different days. The first is to join a 1-week coaching camp for a big block of training, as well as one-on-one coaching on your technical skills, and of course, plenty of advice and tips for your preparation and for the event itself. The other way is to sign up for a 6-month coaching agreement to receive individual day-to-day coaching and one-on-one advice. So thank you very much for listening. Don't hesitate to send me any questions at info@alpinecols.com. And it only remains for me to wish you good luck with your training and look forward to seeing you on the 30th of March.